spray crusted white along the bridge wings, the railings rime bright in the dark, and the sea breathed like a patient animal. On the chart, a tight oval was shaded and labelled in grease pencil, Hedgehog Run, while the American liaison steadied the parallel rulers so they wouldn't clatter. Somewhere abaft, the beam a sister sloop held contact, her ASDIC ticking like a metronome. Bearings passed up a voice tube in soft syllables that smelled of tea and cold metal. The ship carried herself like a boxer on his toes. Sailors moved with mittened hands and chapel voices. The language was spare. Aye, aye. Very good. Mark. The creeping attack split the work like a craftsman's job. One ship held the echo and did not blink. The striker ghosted in on slow revolutions, screws combed smooth to a whisper. The liaison had rolled ash cans before, depth-charge thunder that made white water and left sonar deaf for minutes that felt like years. This was different. The new mortar would throw bombs forward, not aft. An oval of 24 projectiles, about 65 pounds each, the guts torpex and the noses wired to break only when they kissed steel. If they missed, they would stay silent. Silence was the trick. Range 200 to 250 yards, predicted track plotted, bow wave trimmed to nothing. The captain's voice stayed level. Fire! The bow hiccuped, the projectiles went out invisibly, the ship seeming to relax as they flew. 3 breaths later came a dull, ugly sound, the flat clunk of metal on a hull, followed by a deep, felt thud. The deck shivered, then stilled. No one cheered. Oil lifted to the surface like bruised smoke and feathered across the wave tops. A smell like hot coins rode the wind. The liaison printed time and position in block figures and felt the rule book rearrange itself. Reacquire, the captain said, already on to the next task. The holding ship reported contact still firm, a cold heartbeat in the headphones. Men moved as if they'd stepped into a church. Careful boots, careful breath, careful hands on toggles. The liaison wiped a circle of frost from the window and looked into a world of iron, rope and breath that steamed and vanished. He understood why old sailors distrusted celebration. The sea taxed joy with interest. They steadied to make a second run if needed. Bearings came, small corrections, a little port, a little starboard, lives measured in degrees and minutes. The oil widened and the wind sharpened, and somewhere aft a single embarrassed laugh died of its own echo. The ocean gave no applause, it offered one more contact and the promise that the next clunk, if it came, would be just as final. A year earlier, the same track across the map looked like a thread a child might snap. In May 1943, the papers named it Black May, and the name fit the sky. 41 U-boats lost in a single month, staffroom graphs stabbing up like broken masts. On the 24th, Dönitz pulled his boats from the main North Atlantic route, a rare admission that the board had shifted. Centimetric radar began finding what used to hide, HF/DF triangulated whispered signals. Long-range aircraft fenced the old mid-ocean gap. The convoy lifeline stopped looking like prey and started looking like a moving trap. Yet the trap needed teeth. Early trials of an odd-looking projector, 24 spigots bristling from a turntable, taught a quiet lesson. Depth charges made noise, and noise blinded you. Hedgehog did not. Its bombs detonated only when they touched a submarine's skin. A miss stayed mute, so the ASDIC never lost the echo. Doctrine matured like stubborn ivy. Escort groups practiced the creeping attack until voice procedures were poetry. One ship held the contact, another slid in to kill, minute hand to minute hand across the plotting table. The liaison remembered winter watches that came before the change, squinting through frost at seas blown flat by his own weapons, counting to 30 while the set went snow-blind. In those days, a captain might order a wide pattern out of fear of losing the scent, spending explosives like a gambler buying time. Now the tempo shifted. Time itself was the currency, and silence the mint. Small improvements multiplied, a bearing code revised so numbers could be spoken fast without treading on each other, a hand signal simplified so a mitten could make it, an engine room drill shaved seconds from a crash back to slow revolutions. Magazines changed shape, racks lashed for ahead-throwing projectiles, K-guns kept but demoted in the order of battle, maintenance cards updated with torque values and grease types like psalms for survival. By February 1944, a ship like Walker's sloop could work a case in weather that grounded aircraft, returning to the same echo in minutes, not quarter hours. The first clunk of that month did not draw cheers because the men understood what their silence meant. It was the sound of a system coming fully awake. Aircraft ranges married to centimetric sets, bearings to voice discipline, explosives to patience. The ocean had not become friendly, it had become legible. The liaison learned to read it the way a welder reads heat color, by habit, by hand, by heart. 4 lives crossed the numbered ocean without ever touching. In Richmond, California, a welder scraped grit off her goggles with a gloved thumb, called for another set of dogs, and set a bead that sang in the rain. In the Solomons, a destroyer escort sonar striker rehearsed target rate problems by lamplight, tapping a pencil to the rhythm of the screws. In the North Atlantic, a young German funkmart folded a BDU signal into oilskin, the paper damp with his breath. Off Cape Clear, an Irish fisherman mended a torn trawl and watched weather build like an argument. The welder's world was flux, rivet and schedule. Posters near the time clock carried tallies that sounded impossible and happened anyway. The Kaiser yards together would launch 1,490 ships, nearly a third of the Maritime Commission's wartime output, and in record cases a Liberty hull went from keel to launch in under 5 days, the average in the best months driven toward 30. She did not brag, she pointed a torch. Steel moved because hands moved. The striker aboard USS England could have recited the drill in his sleep. Hedgehog. 24 projectiles, roughly 65 pounds apiece, the oval thrown 200 to 250 yards ahead, contact pistols only, so a miss stayed quiet and the echo stayed true. He respected the old K-guns and the racks of depth charges, but he loved the new silence because it let him keep listening. He logged times as if they were prayers. Acquire, creep, fire, reacquire, fire again. The German kept a list in his head that winter. Boats failed to report. Names that had been banter on the pier became gaps in a signal schedule. He believed in seamanship and nerve and knew the faith had not been foolish. The ocean had favoured the bold for years, but messages warned of escorts attacking from ahead, of new decoys that made the G7S acoustic torpedo fall in love with the wrong sound, of weapons that did not give you the mercy of a masking roar. The fisherman thought in smaller units, a mug of tea, the state of the swell, the price at market if the weather broke. He had hauled up planks stamped with foreign letters and corks bobbing in a thin skin of oil. He would have told you the sea kept its dead and returned its story in pieces to men who could not read. They would never meet, but their work fitted like tools in a box. A weld held a deck, boots gripped that deck, code carried fear, and nets wrote footnotes no report could capture. By evening on the 8th of February 1944, the second support group moved like a single muscle. Weather that would have grounded a carrier's deck crew pressed hard from the west, but sloops hunted in foul seas because boats preferred them. The liaison stood where he could watch the helmsman's hands and the captain's mouth, a rectangle of chart light cutting a small stage out of the gloom. The contact locked and held. Bearings in 3 figures slid through the tube, each digit small and exact. The striker advanced, revolutions shaved until the screws were a purr. Hedgehog crews working their lift and seat rhythm, number 4 spigot bulky until a boot heel persuaded it. Fire! Bow kick. Lines tightened. The ocean kept its poker face. Then the flat clunk, the deep follow-through in the bones, oil rising like a rumour. No whoops, just reacquire. and the quiet shuffle of men who knew that seconds were the only coin that mattered. Before dawn, they did it again, the same geometry, the same small words. Inside the same foul day, they did it a third time. 3 U-boats destroyed in roughly 15 hours, the grease pencil X stepping down the chart like careful footprints. On the German boats that lived through that night, wires would have crackled with warnings, escorts attacking from ahead, sonar never blinded by its own weapons, no masking barrage to hide in, decoys astern that lured the clever acoustic torpedoes off like a cruel joke. The tempo itself wounded morale. The old certainty that thunder meant survival if you could ride it out was gone. A petty officer on the strikers' forecastle counted reloads with proprietary affection and grinned without humour. Plenty left, plenty after that. The liaison, who had learned not to trust adjectives at sea, kept to nouns and figures. Pattern, oval, range, 200 yards give or take. Warhead, torpex, fuse, contact, counter, foxer streaming. Doctrine, holder and striker, roles swapped without vanity. Walker's voice on TBS wasted nothing. Ships rotated duties like trained gunners on a mount. When the wardroom finally took tea, a hand chalked 3 small X on the mess board and underlined them twice. No toasts. Grease pencil caps clicked home. Orders crackled for the next case. Dawn smeared itself over a hard sea. Gulls worked the feathered slick while the group came right on new bearings as easily as a man turns a page. The liaison understood then that what looked like luck was only a method, and the method had more hours in it. Ashore the thing looked almost comic, a bristling crown of 24 stubby spigots, a mechanical hedgehog indeed. On deck the joke fell away. Men in duffel coats lifted squat projectiles from racks and nested them with a quarter turn that felt like sealing jars at a winter table. 65 pounds apiece, heavy enough to make the wrists mutter, each bomb capped with a contact pistol that would not detonate unless it kissed steel. The mount sat where a gun might, but it spoke a different grammar. Doctrine turned geometry into rhythm. The striker came in slow, bow parting the chop like a careful hand, range judged not just by rangefinder, but by bones and habit. 200 yards, 250 if the drift wanted it. The pattern was a flattened oval meant to bracket the submarine's likely path, not chase a fading wake. Misses made no sound. That was the point. Without the roar of a wasted pattern, the Azdic never went snowblind. You miss quiet, you try again, a chief told the liaison in mess deck prose. Noise is time and time is blood. There was respect for the old tools. K-guns could still throw a mean curtain. Racks still sat heavy on the stern. A skilled captain could time a depth charge pattern like a boxer's combination. But the mortar changed the intervals. Where depth charges forced you to wait out your own thunder, Hedgehog let you persist. Acquire, creep, fire, reacquire. Minutes shaved from minutes became a new kind of marksmanship. The weapon was American in its impatience and Anglo in its understatement, a union that worked in cold water. The enemy had answers of their own. The G7ES acoustic torpedo was clever and hopeful, designed to ride the song of an escort's screws. The Allies answered with Foxer. Jangling noisemakers streamed astern to seduce the seeker away. Escorts accepted the drag and the embarrassment because life is better than speed. By early 1944, the message traffic admitted it. Boats were dying without the customary uproar. What changed was not the ocean, but the way the fleet read it. Precision crept into places where chance had lived, bearing codes shortened, signal books paired, drills written like recipes. The liaison wrote his notes the way a welder prints a name inside a frame. Times to re-attack, seconds saved, bearing drift held inside a degree. It was not a miracle. It was a system that made miracles seem scheduled. The air in the Solomons tasted of resin and warm rain, the sonar room aboard USS England, a red-lit parlour with gauges for portraits. On the 19th of May, the TBS murmured tasking cued by Frupak decrypts, enemy submarines threading the Admiralty's Solomon's seam, trusting night and distance. The striker rubbed the headset ring on his scalp, sharpened a pencil, and opened a clean page. Acquire, creep, fire, reacquire. The crew had practiced until muscle and procedure were synonyms. The first kill stitched itself into the log with that particular cruelty the crew trusted. Range a couple 100 yards, pattern oval, contact pistol, detonation deep and certain, then wreckage surfacing to say what words could not. 2 days later, another contact, then another. The ship played the same cold music, and the ocean answered on cue. Mrs. stayed silent by design, so the echo stayed true. Again, the officer of the deck said, and the mortar obliged. By the end of 12 days, the count stood at 6 submarines destroyed. The number read like propaganda and felt like a ledger. One small destroyer escort, barely 300 feet of steel and steam, had ended more enemy boats in 12 days than some flotillas managed in a year. There was no swagger. The ship aligned for the next run because the sea did not honour streaks. In the radio shacks of other escorts, a dry line from the Chief of Naval Operations made the rounds. There'll always be an England in the United States Navy. Sailors laughed once and then stopped, because praise can dent discipline. He would remember the weight in the deck gang's hands, 65 pounds apiece, the brief nod the bow gave after each salvo, as if gravity and purpose had agreed. He would remember tropical dawns that smelled of oil, corks bobbing with Japanese characters, the sea speaking in another alphabet. He would remember that the trick was not luck, but silence, a weapon that refused to blind its own ears. Samples were labelled, times were logged, bearings were cleared for the next hunt. 6 in 12 days. Astonishing, yes, but more astonishing for being repeatable under a system that wasted nothing but the enemy's chances. When the headset came off, the ship's own breathing filled the room. The striker wrote the number in the margin and drew a box around it. Then he turned the page, because the ocean still had lines left to read. Shift change rolled like weather through Kaiser Richmond number. 2 yard, steam lifting from rails, cranes slewing with priestly patience, chalkboards rewritten with fresh tallies. The welder tugged her leather gauntlets tight and touched the stinger to plate. The arc flared and the world narrowed to puddle and slag. She did not think of oceans, only of fit-up, heat and time. Yet the foreman's whistle, the gossip at the water barrel, even the posters by the time clock translated into distances measured in lives. 30-day Liberty builds were no brag, but baseline. On good weeks they pushed faster, remembering the record hull put together in a handful of days as a dare to physics. She signed a seam with a soapstone squiggle and felt, quietly, that hands like hers were writing schedules for men she would never meet. She knew the numbers as a catechism because supervisors said them aloud like hymns. 1,490 ships from Kaiser yards before it was over, nearly a third of the Maritime Commission's wartime output. The yard's air tasted of flux and hot steel, boots struck grating with the same beat as the rivet guns. Barges nudged stacks of hedgehog projectiles and racks of depth charges alongside pallets of canned peaches, all of it shuffling toward the same horizon. Abundance was not a slogan, but a texture. Bins refilled before they were empty, spare motors in crates, grease tins stacked like cookies, a warehouse smell of paper, rope, and preservative that clung to coats. Her brother wrote from a destroyer escort that magazines were deep, the word doing more work than bragging could. He described hedgehog crews lifting 65-pound heads into spigots, quarter turn locking them down and liking the quiet of a miss because it kept the echo alive. He did not mention fear. He talked of timing, acquire, creep, fire, reacquire, and of engineers who shaved seconds from engine orders the way the yard shaved days off build sheets. She understood engineers. Their letters sounded like her shift leads, part poetry, part talk spec. Lunch steam-fogged goggles. A woman from Plate Shop passed a clipping. England had stacked kills in a dozen days in the Solomons, that remarkable number spoken softly on the line as if noise might break it. The welder studied the photo, a small ship with a busy deck, the kind her bay berthed like a sow. She tried to imagine oil slicks in warm dawn light and settled for the way the arc puddle flowed when it was perfect, metal obedient to heat. Quitting time rang. She wiped the torch, hung the hood, and walked past a pallet of mortars destined for a ship she would not see. The sun went down behind cranes that looked like praying hands, and the river wore a skin of reflected orange like hot metal cooling slow. Tomorrow, the tally would be higher. That was the plan. That was the weapon. The radio shack smelt of warm varnish and sweat, the air dull with battery tang leaking up from below. The Funkmart cradled headphones over his cap and copied a message from BDU into the log with an ink line that wobbled when the boat met a sea. Warnings in clipped German, escorts attacking from ahead, new weapon detonating only on contact, no masking barrage to hide in, towed acoustic decoys fouling the G7's torpedo's clever ear. He paused as the captain ducked to read, pipe stem pressed flat at the corner of his mouth. They both listened to the thrum of the diesels while they had them and to the hush that followed when they did not. He knew the boat like a small town. Type 7, 44 to 52 men when fully manned, 4 bow tubes and 1 stern, 14 eels aboard when lucky, batteries that drained fast if fear drove them deep and fast. He trusted drills. He respected the ocean, but he did not like this new quiet. In earlier patrols, depth charge runs had been a kind of ghastly liturgy, thunder rolls, shock waves, bulkheads creaking, then blessed silence that meant either you were alive or you knew you were not. Now comrades spoke of a flat clunk and a deep, short thud, as if someone had knocked politely and then removed the floor. Boats failed to report. He kept a private list in his head, names turning to empty spaces on pier-side chalkboards, U238, U762, U734, ghosts written in grease pencil and wiped away. When the captain ordered a T5 ready in the tube, the Funkmart felt the boat tighten with hope. The acoustic seeker would ride the song of the enemy's screws. But then reports came in of Foxer noisemakers, jangling contraptions streamed astern that decoys drew the torpedoes toward like drunks to a bandstand. Even victory had turned noisy and useless. He took the signal pad topside once, the air razor cold, to pass it in gloved hands. The sea was a hammered plate, the sky a darker steel. The watch whispered about an escort group that had killed 3 boats in roughly 15 hours in monstrous weather, as if storms now served the enemy. He tried not to think in arithmetic. 14 torpedoes sounded like plenty in harbour, and like 2 when hunted. Batteries that read full on the gauge felt like a handful of breaths when the ASDIC pings meant someone above was counting exactly. He closed the log and slipped the headset down around his neck, hearing his own blood as loudly as the set. The captain folded the message into oilskin, lit the pipe, and said nothing. The Funkmart imagined a weapon that only spoke when it struck and wished, suddenly and without reason, for the roaring waste of the old charges to come back and hide them. Under red lights, the plotting table looked like a clock face that had learned language. Grease arcs marked predicted tracks. Thin chalk lines showed bearing drift. Pencil dots recorded time. Acquire, creep, fire, reacquire, as if writing a metronome into the sea. The escort CO had paired voice procedures until they could be spoken with a mitten on. The talker's words were dried fruit, nothing extra. The sonar striker traced the echo like a pulse, grateful that a miss made no racket, that the set never went snowblind after a run. Silence itself had become a tactic. Statisticians ashore, dry men with sharp pencils and wartime eyes, wrote what crews already felt. Depth charges took on the order of 60 attacks to yield a kill. Hedgehog brought that ratio toward 1 in 6, an order of magnitude swing that turned luck into schedule. Minutes once squandered in white water were banked for re-attacks. The striker could hear the math in the calm of the bridge. No detonation, attack again immediately. The sentence had the weight of a general order and the simplicity of common sense. The numbers scaled into something like fate. Independent support groups, freed from convoy leashes, rode out weather and doctrine both, prosecuting contacts until the sea surrendered a slick wreckage, or, rarely, survivors. Nearby air cover trimmed the Wolfpack's preferred hours. Centimetric radar broke the old magic of night. HF/DF pinned down transmissions like nails. And below all that, the mortar's quiet insistence shortened every loop. Ships traded roles without vanity, drills shaved seconds. A single escort could lift and seat those 65-pound heads until the crew's forearms ached and still have reloads stacked like promises. Every few watches, a staff officer would bring a broader ledger, and the bridge would fall briefly into awe that didn't show on faces. Liberty ships, 2,710 hulls across the war, rolled off ways, while Germany built roughly 1,156 U-boats of all types, a comparison that felt impossible and yet sat heavy in black ink. The striker knew better than to crow. He simply wrote the next bearing, the next time, the next fire. Process was not a word the wardroom loved, but it crept into behaviour until it felt like destiny. When the ship came right onto new bearings and the mortarmen lifted another round, the striker remembered the first time he trusted the quiet. The way the headset stayed alive after a miss, the way the captain's voice didn't have to fill a gap with guesswork. He smoothed the page with his palm, as if steadying the ocean by steadying paper. Out past the bow, the sea was just as cold, just as cruel, and now somehow legible. The next contact would be handled the same way. That was not complacency. That was victory behaving like habit. Stateside, a briefing room smelled of chalk and hot coffee, the air thick with the sound of coat sleeves against maps. The wall carried 2 columns, headlines on the left, ledgers on the right. 7 in 12 days? Asked a clipping above a photograph of a small ship at speed. Opposite, in tidy letters, someone had written what really mattered. England's 6 boats in 12 days in the Solomons, and Walker's group's 6 boats in roughly 20 days in the North Atlantic, 3 of them in something like 15 hours between dusk and bad light. No one mocked the headline. They simply retired it in favour of a better miracle, the kind you can plan. The staff officer traced curves that had once frightened him. Black May, 1943, had redefined the slope. 41 U-boats sunk in a month, and BDU forced to withdraw from the main Atlantic route on 24th May. But the slope stayed steep because the system hardened. Centimetric radar, HF/DF, long-range air, independent support groups, FOXER, to mock the T5's smart ear, and a forward-throwing mortar that made silence into a weapon. Kill efficiency was written in ratios, about 1 per 60 attacks with ashcans, about 1 per 6 with hedgehog, and in time saved, minutes instead of quarters for a re-attack cycle. A logistics major ran a finger along shipping tonnage delivered before and after the shift. Convoy loss rates fell to levels planners had once called optimistic to the point of fantasy. Charts connecting ports to staging areas grew bold enough to ink invasion calendars over them. Without the new tempo, the argument went, the assault timetables for 1944 become academic exercises. With it, ships sailed, troops arrived, the arithmetic of bridges and depots turned from questions into dates. The room did not sneer at the enemy's earlier dominance. Wolfpack doctrine had worked until it didn't, and no honest sailor forgot the years when the ocean ate ships with horrifying appetite. What changed was not courage, but the tool chain through which courage moved. A mortar that refused to blind its own ears married to a doctrine that refused to waste time became a hinge. The staffer took a stick and tapped the board where 7 had been written, then circled system and drew a line to the timetable pinned under glass. Break was called. Men closed folders that would have been secrets yesterday and would be news tomorrow. The officer at the door turned off a lamp and left the other burning. The leftover light fell on a small brass plaque that read, "Silence saves seconds, seconds save ships." He smiled without humour at the tidy truth and went to sign for more chalk. Off Cape Clear, the fisherman let the net rise slow to spare his back. Bits of timber knocked together in the scuppers, a language of dings and chips. There was oil on the water, not fresh, but the sort that clung to ropes and skin, no matter how you scrubbed. He found a cork with Japanese lettering and set it on a coil where the gulls could look it over. He had learned to keep his thoughts between himself and the kettle. War turned the sea into a ledger written in salvage. He read lines as they surfaced and kept the grammar to himself. Elsewhere, the welder stood in a quiet room where photographs climbed a wall, cranes, keels, ships on greased ways, and a plaque listing the yard's totals like a eulogy for effort. She thought of her brother's letters, the tidy handwriting that had described the sound after a hit as something felt in the soles before the ears could name it. She had believed, from the first day the whistle cut through fog and sparks, that her work mattered. Now the photographs made it too large to hold. It was easier to remember torque values and welding rod designations than to look long at the numbers. On a grey Atlantic, a sonar striker lined up at a memorial. A chaplain's voice moved carefully through names, wind taking the edges off syllables. The striker did not count, though he could have. He listened for breaths. He knew the convoy loss curves had bent hard down, that delivered tonnage had swollen until planners spoke invasion schedules as if they were train timetables. He also knew the names of messmates who were not here to be comforted by charts. The Hedgehog's quiet had saved seconds and ships. It had not made war merciful. In a small kitchen on the Baltic, a mother read a letter that did not say what it meant. Failed to report was a phrase that the paper could carry, and the heart could not. She folded the page along the creases and set it beneath a clock that had lost its pendulum to the war. She imagined thunder and chose, because love asked it, to picture noise rather than the flat clunk sailors spoke of. She put the kettle on and looked out at a street that refused to say anything back. The fisherman tipped tea over the side with an old prayer and watched the brown dissolve in green. Gulls hung like punctuation above the slick. He pulled his net hand over hand and thought of the way war sorted men by distances, yards, miles, oceans, and then, when it was over, left them close again in memory. The cork rolled in the scupper and knocked once, like a polite ghost asking to be remembered. Years later, under museum lights that made brass look warmer than war ever had, the striker touched a plaque the way you test a weld. Gentle, then with confidence. The display mortar sat with its 24 spigots lifted like a crown. A card explained what his hands already knew, roughly 65 pounds per projectile, about 30 to 35 pounds of high explosive inside, thrown 200 to 250 yards ahead, contact fused, misses silent by design. Children walked past with paper hats and questions. He answered the easy ones and left the hard ones resting where they belonged, between a man and the sea. Across the hall, a panel mapped production and doctrine as a single conversation. A line chart of Liberty launches rose like a tide, 2,710 hulls in all. Another, of U-boat construction, lifted and stalled under the strain of bombing and resource starvation, totalling roughly 1,156. The curator's note did not crow, but the comparison read like sorcery. One free nation building more than twice the enemy's signature weapon class in merchant hulls alone, while Kaiser's yards by themselves launched 1,490 ships, more than the U-boats Germany completed across the entire war. It seemed impossible and was true because hands made it so. A docent told a group that in Black May 1943, the Allies sank 41 U-boats in a single month. By most tallies, more than German yards could have replaced in the same span, and that on 24th May, Dönitz had withdrawn from the North Atlantic trade lanes. The striker listened with a craftsman's pride that felt like reverence. He remembered how silence saved seconds and seconds saved ships, and how the creeping attack made patience lethal. He remembered the Foxer humming in the wake, teasing smart torpedoes away like a magician's handkerchief. He remembered how the best captains sounded bored when they killed, because boredom was another word for control. At a smaller case, the welder rested her palm on a section of deck grating she might have burned herself, and for a moment all the noise came back. The arcs hiss, cranes talking in steel, the yard whistle cutting air. She thought of a quote somebody had chalked on a bulkhead near the canteen. "There'll always be an England in the US Navy," and how the laugh it drew had been quick and shy, like sailors tasting praise and putting it away for later. The striker lowered his hand from the plaque and left the line of fingerprints among others. Outside, the city sounded like peacetime. Traffic, a bus brake's sigh, a child's cartoon voice. He closed his eyes and heard faintly and forever the headset's calm ocean, the held contact, the captain's even order to fire. The idea that beat the wolf packs was still there, perfectly quiet, strong as a weld.